Greetings and felicitations. This is Michael Haspel. This is actually QFD episode 25, but we're going to take a one episode break from our Wrath of Khan deep dive. I have a thing on Patreon where some of my patrons can request like a podcast about anything they want. And of course I can back out of whatever subject I don't want to talk about if the need arises. But one of my patrons, David Tyrell, who is a second cousin to Dr. Eldon Tyrell of the Tyrell Corporation, though he will deny it if asked, he asked what is my favorite 30K or 40K story, or what story would I tell if I had carte blanche to play in the 30K and 40K IP. And some of you may know that I am a contributor to the Long War podcast, which is a Warhammer 40K podcast. So I'm taking a short break from the Wrath of Khan to do this podcast, and then we will resume with the Wrath of Khan with the next one. So thank you. 5, 4, 3, hands on keys, turn. They shall be my finest warriors, these men who give themselves to me. Like clay, I shall mold them, and in the furnace of fire I shall forge them. They will be of iron will and steely muscle. In great armor shall I clad them. With the mightiest gun shall they be armed. They will be untouched by plague or disease. No sickness will blight them. They will have tactics, strategies, and machines such that no foe will best them in battle. They are my bulwark against the terror. They are the defenders of humanity. They are my space marines, and they shall know no fear. Greetings, brothers and sisters. It is I, humble remembrancer, Mikhail Haspiliam, here recounting the words of our most sacred emperor of mankind, upon his creation of the Adeptus Astartes, who become renowned as the Angels of Death, the Space Marines. Okay, obviously I'm going to have a little bit of fun here. As most of you know, I am dedicated to the world of Warhammer 40K. I've fallen into it hook, line, and sinker, and almost all the aspects of it. I want to jump right in and not use up a whole lot of time to answer David's question, the first part of his question. What is my favorite 30K, 40K story? And that is really, really hard to answer for me because it is kind of the whole thing. The entire milieu is part of it. I will answer some specific stories, but I wanted to just talk about kind of where Warhammer 40K came from. And this is not going to be a deep dive episode. Perhaps we can do one of those in the future. So I reserve the right, just like I do on the Long War, to be wrong about anything and to backtrack if I have to. But I'm going to try to keep things at least correct. So you have to understand that like Games Workshop and Citadel were two different companies, and there was actually a third company in there at one point as well too. Citadel made miniatures, and Games Workshop made games. That's pretty well known. Citadel made miniatures for the little-known game at the time of Dungeons & Dragons. So they started making these miniatures, then they started playing these miniatures. They found out that they were using the miniatures to play battles more than they were doing the role-playing aspect of it. Enter Games Workshop. Games Workshop comes up with the Warhammer universe. That's the fantasy universe, what folks know as the old world, which has since been destroyed and recrafted into the Age of Sigmar Warhammer fantasy setting. So Warhammer 40K was initially supposed to just be a science fiction version of Warhammer. And essentially that's what it is. But this happened in the early 80s with a game called Rogue Trader. Now, when this was coming up, we need to keep in mind that this was just some friends wargaming. They happened to have a company that was turning out a product. And that at the time, hobby companies people weren't as IP savvy as they are now, for certain. And a perfect example of that is I will get to in a moment. But in any case, these hobby companies are just they're creating things that are fun, that are just really cool to play. They're not concerning themselves with IPs, with making a lot of money. They're grabbing bits and pieces of things that they find fun and that they like and that they find attractive, and throwing it all in there, you know. And the example I was alluding to is like famously FASA that helped make BattleTech. They got in a load of trouble because a lot of the mechs, which are now known as the Unseen, were based on mechs from a lot of Japanese anime, notably Robotech, and a couple of other shows as well. But it's like the Phoenix Hawk was straight up a Veritech fighter. I think it's the Marauder was Zentradi Quadrano powered armor. There were a number of different of different mechs that were directly taken from Japanese animes, and they were sued later on. And those mechs became known as quote unquote the Unseen because they're still floating around there. If you have some, don't do what I did and donate them to a wargaming club, because they're probably worth some decent coin. You can probably get some money on them or just keep them for geek cred. They're really cool. With Warhammer 40K, it became a conglomeration of all these different fantasy and sci-fi properties and even, heavy metal album covers. It's just, it just became everything that was kind of in the zeitgeist of the sci-fi of the late 80s. So it kind of does fit with our whole, kind of retro 80s, what are we analyzing for our season 1 of QFD. It definitely fits into that. Probably one of the largest influences, and all of this, take with a grain of salt, this is all my opinion. I don't have definitive proof on a lot of this because I didn't do any research. This is all off the top of my head, because I live and breathe Warhammer 40K. One of the largest influences, I would say, is probably Dune. And I adore Dune. And, the Lisan al-Gaib, the whole story of that and everything, the original Dune, I adore. I also like Dune Messiah and Children of Dune. I haven't really gotten into the Kevin Anderson kind of prequel, other stories that are, I honestly can't even comment on them because I have not gotten into them enough. But there are some very clear references to Dune that are in 40K, some parallels. The Emperor, the Star Emperor of Dune, granted, he's alive and not in a golden throne in Dune, Emperor Shaddam IV. But the whole idea of having a Star Emperor is definitely at the core of Warhammer 40K. I'm not saying Dune is the only thing that has that, but when I start talking about some of the other influences, you'll kind of see I'm not stretching very far. The Bene Gesserit, can be easily seen as either the Sisters of Silence or the Battle Sisters, Sisters of Battle. They hail from, there's a whole organization called the Ministora Protectiva that goes and seeds the galaxy with legends and stuff of the Bene Gesserit, so that when the Bene Gesserit show up, people are already primed to accept their prophecies. That kind of thing happens definitely in Warhammer 40K, especially the Order of All Women that are kind of spooky and possess powers that other people don't understand or have. That's the Sisters of Silence, being untouchable. They leave no presence in the warp. That's definitely a huge part of it. The Navigator and the Navigator houses, that is taken directly from Dune. They need navigators to empower their ships to travel faster than light. That is exactly what navigators do in Warhammer 40K. We also have other places. If you start looking at the Sardaukar, if you start looking at the Fremen still suits, is a perfect example. And when Necromunda was first released, I'm not talking about this latest release that came out, last year, I guess? It's been a year already? Wow. But the Van Sar gang wore still suits that were fresh out of Dune. And when I want to say, too, a lot of the influences aren't taken from Dune, the book, although certainly they're there. It's almost like they're all taken from the David Lynch film, Dune, which is under the name Alan Smithy because he took his name off of it. And someday we'll have to do a deep dive of Dune because the stories behind that are just insane. The next biggest influence, in my opinion, is Starship Troopers by Robert Heinlein. Starship Troopers gives us the bugs, the Tyranids. It also gives us, obviously, Space Marines in powered armor, drop pods, chaplains. A lot of stuff comes out of Starship Troopers. The way the Space Marines fight, the somewhat fascist overtones of the Warhammer 40K Imperium of Man, all that derives from Starship Troopers. And we also obviously get 2000 AD, those series of comics, which folks may know better as the Judge Dredd comics. We get the Hive cities from there, mega cities. We get the Enforcers, which look, in the early versions of the Enforcers, they looked like judges from 2000 AD because Citadel actually made miniatures of Judge Dredd with his lawgiver and the lawmaster. So it just falls right in. Again, it's like, hey, I like this, let's toss it in. Hey, I like this, let's toss it in. And they're not really worried about does it make sense? Does it jive right? Do we have is this licensed? They don't really care. So it just becomes a conglomeration. Of course, along with the Tyranids, not just from Starship Troopers, we get the kind of the influence of the species Internecivus raptus from Alien and Aliens, which is, of course, which is actually how I got into Warhammer 40K back in 88, 89, when they released Space Hulk. My friends and I got that game because it was like the Colonial Marines battling xenomorphs under sublevel 3 in the James Cameron film Aliens. I mean, down to like just being super intense, and you play with an hourglass or a timer. It was really awesome. We adored it. That's how I actually got into Warhammer 40K and exposed into that universe. We also get just other influences. Tolkien, of course, with the Eldar. Originally, the Eldar are the name that the Valar give to the elves in Lord of the Rings. We have the Eldar being kind of a doomed elven race in Warhammer 40K, and that's why we kind of joke that they're space elves, because that's what they are. Now, the Dark Eldar, once they get introduced, they become something different. And there's a lot of Hellraiser influence throughout of all of 40K as well, with the servitors, all kinds of stuff like that. Obviously, the Dark Eldar are all about like Hellraiser, very, very influenced by that. H.P. Lovecraft is seeded all through Warhammer 40K, from the Tyranids to the Old Ones to the war between the Necron and the Catan and the Old Ones, all kinds of stuff like that. It's Lovecraft is entirely through there, the entire forbidden knowledge of the warp, all kinds of stuff like that. Terminator with the Necron, and for those who weren't playing, may have recently gotten into 40K in the last couple of years, the Necron have a rule where they don't die immediately. Like, you have to damage them enough that they come back. Well, in the early versions of the Necron, up until 4th edition, I think, that actual rule was called "We'll be back." And an obvious homage to the Terminator. And it was, 40K didn't take itself as seriously as it does now, and they still try to throw in a little bit of humor and stuff like that. I remember like one of the Black Templar codices in 4th edition had the Black Orb of Antioch, which is very clearly a reference to the Holy Hand Grenade of Antioch from Monty Python. We've got obviously the Tau, a lot of it comes from Mobile Suit Gundam. Their philosophy, a lot of it comes from Taoism. They throw in a ton of, just little Easter eggs all over the place. Sly Marbo, obviously an allusion to Rambo, because Rambo dominated the 80s. I mean, just absolutely, with First Blood coming out in 82 and then Rambo Part 2 coming out later on in that decade. Rambo was kind of the iconic hero of that decade. Kind of just represented the, at least one part of the psychology that was going on in that decade. We have other, of course, some of the names are a little bit too on the nose. Inquisitor Torquemada Cotillas, but the captain of the Thousand Sons, and this is stuff that's still modern, that they still have in the game, is named Hathor Ma'at, which are two deities from ancient Egypt, and of course the Thousand Sons are all kind of have this Egyptian aesthetic running through it. You have Arjak Rockfist, as people pronounce it, was Aryak, I think is the way it's supposed to be. Aryak Rockfist is very clearly Thor. Njal Stormcaller is tied to Odin. He's also, because Odin was sometimes known as the Stormfather. There's of course this entire thing with the ravens, with Njal Stormcaller. We have Lucas the Trickster, who's very much Loki. We have Inquisitor Fyodor Kamaradzov, in the Witch Hunters Codex back in the day. He's the guy in the throne, and that goes around. That's taken from Fyodor Dostoevsky and the brothers Karamazov, which is the book that he wrote. There's even a chapter in that book called The Grand Inquisitor. So it's just kind of funny that they're like, oh, this is what I'm reading. That one of my favorite names that they came up with was for one of the first named inquisitors. In fact, I think he is the named inquisitor. His name is Obi-Wan Sherlock Clouseau. So Obi-Wan, obviously a Star Wars reference. Sherlock, obviously Sherlock Holmes. And Clouseau is the Pink Panther from the Inspector Clouseau Pink Panther films that were very, very popular during that time. So when kind of having to pin down the Warhammer 30K, what's my favorite story, or 40K, I have to say the whole thing, because I love every single one of those things that influenced Warhammer 40K. So I adore them all. If I have to pick, one overarching story, then I have to say it's the Horus Heresy, which of course is 30K and starts the whole mess, right? The main reason I love that is because It is a science fiction retelling of Milton's Paradise Lost. And I'm sure a lot of people that play Warhammer 40K, this is very obvious to them. Of course, the 40K setting is not the first one to take Paradise Lost and the story of a war in heaven between God and the great adversary and retell it in a different way. Tolkien famously does that in the opening chapters of the Silmarillion with the Valar and Morgoth, who decides to go his own way against Iluvatar. So the Horus heresy is very heavily influenced. We've got Horus, who rebels against the emperor, openly rebels. He's the favored son, very much like Lucifer was supposed to be the brightest, the best, and the brightest of all the angels. He takes half of the angels with him. They, fall from heaven in this big battle. The same thing happens with Horus, where he takes half his angels, and keep in mind that the Adeptus Astartes that are often known as the angels of death. And as a quick side note, Astartes is even another influence. Astarte is another name for Ishtar. It's a goddess of war and sexuality, I think, that was worshipped by, well, I think the Egyptians around biblical times, so that would be New Kingdom, and the Canaanites and maybe the Hittites worshipped Astarte. And it's somewhat a Greco-Romanized version of Ishtar, because I think the name in the Bible might be Ashtoreth or something. Anyway, that's a tangent. But that whole story of the fall of Lucifer and the fall of Horus and his seduction to quote unquote the dark side, right? That's what that story is about. That's the Horus heresy. And if you ever chance upon reading Paradise Lost, which is, especially if you read in an authentic version of it, it has a lot of really old-timey spellings, because spelling at the time Milton wrote it were not standardized. So he kind of just sounds things out. It can be a slog. So I would recommend, if you're going to read Paradise Lost, to try to find a version with some standardized spellings. Otherwise, it slows you down significantly. But when Lucifer is trying to amass his army to take on God, he goes to try to find some allies, essentially, to bolster him, to help him, right? And he goes to the edge of hell, and finds a being there. And it's kind of very nebulous in the poem, but that being is called Chaos. And Chaos has these weird courtiers. Chaos and Old Night are who live down there. It's like Chaos and Night are these two kind of beings that are qualities, but they're also kind of personified characters. And Chaos is surrounded by these kind of weird courtiers, right? And they are known as Chance, Rumor, Tumult, and Discord. Or, as we might know them, Tzeentch, Slaanesh, Khorne, and Nurgle. So I just really like the way that they took this and, massaged it. And yeah, it's gone through a lot of retcons and everything like that to create the Warhammer 40K universe. If I have to pick one specific event out of Warhammer 30K, I would have to say it is the fall of Prospero, or the burning of Prospero. That entire story about how, and I'm not going to go through it step by step. I could do an entire episode about it, honestly. But it is one of my favorite stories because I love the Space Wolves. I love the whole kind of space werewolf Viking aspect of the Space Wolves. And I love the Thousand Sons. I love their whole story of corruption, of their intent to do right, but through the wrong methods, I, of course, adore their entire Egyptian motif because I got a special place in my heart for ancient Egypt. And I love the entire idea of the whole thing's kicked off with, Magnus and trying to do the right thing. And he doesn't know, even though he's been told by the Emperor not to use psychic powers and that the warp is dangerous. And the Emperor knows this by this point and holds a council called the Council of Nicaea, which, again, this is another example of an influence being brought in. There is a real-world Council of Nicaea, which could also be pronounced Nicaea, that occurred, I want to say, in around the 300 of the Common Era, and it was presided over by the Emperor Constantine, and it's where they kind of officially said these are the books of the Bible that go in there. They came up with the Nicene Creed. They also discussed the nature, the divinity of Christ the Son versus Christ the God, as opposed to like God the Father. All kinds of stuff came out of there. So Warhammer 40K just wholesale steals the name. They put it on a planet called Nicaea, and it's supposed to discuss what's going to happen to all the librarians, which are the psychic space marines, and what's going to happen to Magnus. They kind of put him on trial because he's been told not to use the warp and not to use forbidden magic. You get a little bit of Lovecraft in there, knowledge that humanity was never meant to know, that kind of thing. You're conspiring with forces you're not meant to, that kind of thing. And then he gets sent back. He's found guilty. He gets sent back to his planet of Prospero and discovers that Horus is going to betray the Emperor. And the road to hell is paved with good intentions. He uses sorcery to try to warn the Emperor that Horus is going to betray him, not understanding that he's being manipulated by one of the chaos gods, Tzeentch. And he goes and actually causes a lot of damage to special project the Emperor is working on, a new webway, and kills a bunch of people by just psychically manifesting. And more importantly, he drops all the protective wards that are in the Imperial Palace. So he causes all kinds of damage, and the Emperor sends the Wolves of Fenris to sanction the Thousand Sons and kind of bring them to justice. And it's kind of part misunderstanding and part tragedy, and the whole thing might have been avoided. And I love stories like that. It's also one of the rare chances we get to see the Custodes in action, to see the Sisters of Battle in action, to see these Primarchs, Lehman Russ and Magnus going at it. There's so much stuff going on. And then I love how there are hints throughout the lore that maybe the Thousand Sons were not entirely sanctioned, that the Blood Ravens carry their gene seed up until Warhammer 40K times, and that the Inquisition keeps a really close eye on them. So I adore that story. That would probably be my favorite one out of Warhammer 30K. Now, out of Warhammer 40K, there are a lot of them that I really, really like. The two books that I would recommend are probably 15 Hours, which by Mitchell Scanlon, and Necropolis by Dan Abnett, which is one of the Gaunt's Ghost novels. They really encompass the whole setting very, very well. Necropolis is about the defense of a Hive city against essentially a Nurgle cult and an outbreak of Nurgle plague zombies that goes awry. 15 Hours is essentially a part of, it's almost like a 40K telling of Stalingrad. Of how just desperate these defenders are holding on. And it's the story of a new recruit that shows up and doesn't understand why every time somebody asks, he's like, hey, I have a coat, but my coat has a hole in it and it's no good. I need a new coat. And they go, oh, okay, you need a new coat? Come back in 15 hours. And he can't really understand why. It's a really good book, very, very quick read. Of course, for the 30K story I was just talking about, I would recommend 1,000 Suns by Graham McNeil, which has the story told from the 1,000 Suns point of view of what was going on. And then Prospero Burns by Dan Abnett, which is the other half of the story told from the Wolves of Fenris. And it's kind of, it's a little bit of a pastiche because it is kind of a retelling of the Eaters of the Dead by Michael Crichton, which got turned into the movie The 13th Warrior. And so it has a lot of those influence in there. But Dan Abnett did also a lot of research on some old Viking stories, and he's woven them in here in a sci-fi setting, and it's really, really good. He's taken some of these old sagas and put them in here. I adored both of these books, and I kind of think they have to be read together. And initially when they were going to be published, they were going to be published like a month apart. And there were Dan had some health issues arise, so they were published about a year apart. But I really think they need to be read back to back to get the entire full impact of it. And of course, if you really want to get down in the weeds of the Prospero, of the fall of Prospero, or purging of Prospero, or burning of Prospero, look up the book Inferno that's by Forge World. It's a 30K book. And it's one of their big ones, and it costs, in excess of $100. It is really solid. It's written like a history book, like it actually happened. It's phenomenal, with illustrated pictures and everything, super high quality, well worth the money, if you're into this kind of thing. So to answer David's second part of his question, if I had carte blanche to play in the 30K 40K IP, what kind of story would I tell? That's a little bit easier because I've actually submitted a huge amount of stories. I wouldn't say huge, but at least throughout the years, probably at least 20 stories to Black Library. And alas, they haven't picked up any. So that's too bad for me. But, and I've told, I've written down stories that are based in Necromunda, that are 40K, that are, I should have done one for for Shadespire. That might, because I really like that entire setting and everything too. But we're going to just stick with the 30K, 40K IP. I would probably stick with the 40K rather than go back and do 30K stuff. I prefer the 40K milieu where things have just gone wrong and have fallen apart and it's not working out. The whole vision of hope and the crusade and all that stuff, that's long gone by Warhammer 40K, and I just prefer that. And if I had to pick, if I could write about anything, there's two stories that I kind of would want to do, and one is not original at all. It's actually from the 5th edition Grey Knights Codex. And I know that there's, people do not like Matt Ward. I actually really liked all of his fluff because one of the things I think people need to take with a grain of salt is that a lot of this fluff, especially considering the Grey Knights, it's like the movie 300. It's an exaggeration. It's imperial propaganda. And if you think about it, if you're sitting in a bar or something like that and you bring up DevGru, SEAL Team 6, or Delta, right? People almost speak about them in hushed whispers. Like, oh man, these are the guys that are super badasses and they did this and they did this and they did this. And you have people out there in the world claiming to be Navy SEALs and they get outed and all this stuff. But it's like the average person does not know what SEAL Team 6 does. They don't know what Delta does. They don't know what other, these kind of secret elite warrior organizations do. And I think that is the same thing with Grey Knights. That if you went into a 40K equivalent of a bar after these workers have finished, working for the machine god on their 18-hour shift, and they're going to take a half-hour break to throw down some, amasec, but honestly, they can't even afford the amasec, so they probably just congregate around, an area where a guy has worked out a still where he's, using some illegal engine parts or something to filter this alcohol that's going to kill them, but who cares, because life expectancy is 24 in the bowels of this hive city. And they want to tell themselves these stories of the emperor, and who the space marines are. And they go, oh man, they're one-upping one another. And they may have heard some imperial propaganda that, badder than the bad, there's these guys called Grey Knights, and they don't leave anybody alive. If you even see the Grey Knights, they purge entire planets. And it's like, okay, well then who's telling the stories, man? You know what I mean? Like, if that's actually true, how do we know anything about the Grey Knights? It's because it's not true. And I just really like that Matt Ward just took that to the extreme. And it's like the movie 300, when Delios is telling these Spartan warriors on the eve of the Battle of Plataea. He's trying to pump them up. He's trying to psych them up. And so he's telling them the story of Leonidas and how, he did all these things, and that Xerxes is 8 feet tall, and there are these giant monsters that are like part rhinoceros, part elephant, but they were, 2-3 stories tall, and they're charging the Spartan line, and the Spartans held, and he's just aggrandizing every single thing in that story, that the arrows blotted out the sun, all this kind of thing, right? And that's what's going on. That's what Matt Ward was doing in the fluff and in the 5th edition codex. At least that's the way I kind of felt it and read it. And he has a story in there called The Battle of the Ghost Halls. And I just am like, man, I would really love to take a crack at that story. And what the story is that the prognosticators, which are Grey Knights that kind of like look into the future to try to see where there's like demonic activity is going to pop up, they see that Melanti, which is this like craft world that was attacked by Tyranids and essentially wiped out. But a lot of the soul stones of the Eldar are still there, and there's still some Eldar there. They're not completely wiped out. But there is a Lord of Change, like a huge, greater demon that is there. And the Grey Knights send purifiers and a bunch of Grey Knights, and they fight, and it includes one of my favorite Grey Knight characters ever, which is Justicar Thawne, Anvil Thawne. And he's I call him the Highlander. He's one of these perpetuals that can't die. He keeps coming back, and he happens to be a Grey Knight. And I love that entire story. And, I feel that GW, by dumping some of these characters in the later dexes because they didn't have models or whatever, I think they did themselves a disservice. It's like, guys, just put out a model. It's really not that hard nowadays. It doesn't even need to be something crazy. It could just be a different Justicar without, a helmet on his head or something, and just call him Justicar Thawne. So I also adore Grandmaster Mordrak, the entire story with the Ghost Knights. I would love to write a novel based on that, on how the Ghost Knights came about, on how the Grey Knights deal with this dude can summon Ghost Knights. Like, that doesn't seem entirely kosher, but hey, whatever, it's like, I would love to do that. And then if I had, I could write about anything I wanted at all. I would write a story about one of these emissaries imperatus, which is one of these custodes that they get sent out on their own. And he would get sent out on like a Dirty Dozen mission, but instead of just a dozen people that he has to get, he's out there with like a squad of Sisters of Silence, some Sisters of Battle that are read into this like super secret program. Some Grey Knights, some Death Watch, right? All the Inquisition working together. Of course, some Grand Inquisitors that are helping him do this. And then they're overseeing a company of Space Marines that are all the dregs of these other companies, but instead of being guys that were in prison or whatever, like the Dirty Dozen, these are guys that have been exposed to stuff that was damaging enough to their psyche that they've all been mind wiped and kind of reprogrammed. So it's a little bit of like Joss Whedon's Dollhouse, but with like the Dirty Dozen mixed in, and it would just be like a series of different missions these guys go on, the most impossible of the impossible. No one's ever expected to come back, that kind of thing, but they keep coming back time after time. I would love to write a number of series like that. And along those lines with that, I'm going to drop off. And when we come back on the next episode, we will be fully engaged with Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, actually doing a scene-by-scene breakdown of the film and talking about the dramatic choices made, the story choices made, delving into everything from the Star Trek Freudian trio all the way through how they did some of the visual effects and why it is considered by many, including myself, as the finest Star Trek film ever made. So until then, remember that blessed is the mind too small for doubt. Mike, out.
Keep us from the sea. Here we stand, open arms. This is home where we are, ever strong in the world that we made. I still hear you in the breeze, see your shadows in the trees, holding on, memories never change.
You have been listening to Quantum Froth Dispatches by Michael Haspel. Music and other cues are provided by The Fat Rat. The song you're hearing is Monody, featuring Laura Brem. If you would like to support the podcast, please visit www.patreon.com/QFD. Thank you for listening, and we now return you to your mundane reality.